Welcome to the Filmlings podcast,
a bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 103, World War II Action.
Yes, the midway point, actually, in our series on World War II and World War II films, both made in and about the era. And we are talking today about movies that focus on the battles of the war at the nitty-gritty level, the action
all
that we
across
see.
the war, too, which I don't think I really planned, but we've got...
Western Front, Eastern
Europe,
Front, and the Pacific War.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We're all across the board.
There were several other theaters, but those are probably the three biggest. Easily the three biggest, actually, in the war, and three different types of movies to go into them. The first of which is a classic Hollywood fare number by the name of The Great Escape from 1963. It was directed by John Sturges. One of the really skilled kind of journeyman directors of the era who did a lot of really solid work, but isn't, as well known by modern film scholar or modern film students and film aficionados, I would say. Once you get into once you start really diving down, you see that the French New Wave really likes Sturges and stuff like that. And he has a lot of work like this specifically.
Yeah. But we have covered The Magnificent Seven, so.
Yeah. He's really good with stuff like that. You're typically masculine action fare epics.
So Steve McQueen movies.
Yeah, yes, very much so. And this was based on both the actual event, The Great Escape, which was a real thing that happened during World War II, and the 1950 book about the event, which was written by Paul Brickhill. And it actually received an Oscar nomination for Best Editing.
Oh, that's it?
Yep, that's it, which is actually really surprising. 1963 is actually, I think, a pretty good year for the Oscars, comparatively.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of fare going on right there. But this is definitely like a blockbuster of the day. This is as close, one of the things that you get as close to like a superhero movie of the 1960s.
Right. Absolutely.
This is meant to entertain. It's meant to be big and flashy, but it's not necessarily meant to be high art. And that kind of shows in the number of Oscar nominations that it received.
Yeah, and then second up, we have Come and See from 1985, directed by Elem Klimov. It's a Russian film written with Alice Adamovich. Alice Adamovich, who actually fought in the Belarusian with the Belarusian partisans, which is what the film is about, as we'll see. And the title of the film, which it's not really ever brought up within the film, but it comes from the 6th chapter of Revelation, or the Apocalypse of John, about the fourth horseman, death. So that's a very ominous beginning, and we'll get into how all the stuff that happens in that movie, because that one is a heavy movie.
It's accurate.
Yeah, right.
Finally, we're going to talk about The Thin Red Line from 1998, which is by director Terrence Malick. And it's kind of like the first in his newer, in his return to cinema, so to speak. You can kind of break up his film into two eras, and this is kind of his new style. It's very similar to Hidden Life, which we talked about on the bonus podcast in terms of style. Yeah. And it is based on a 1962 novel of the same name by James Jones, and it received a lot of nominations, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Writing, Best Cinematography, Best Sound, Best Editing, and Best Original Score.
No wins?
No wins. That's kind of the history of Terrence Malick. He likes doing his own thing, even though it's not necessarily what everybody else 100% loves. And a lot of his movies typically get the review of, I really liked it. I don't think it knew what it was about, but it really liked it. So, and we'll get into that when we get into that movie individually. But first, we have two other movies to get through. And Jason, take it away with the summary for The Great Escape from 1963.
The Great Escape from 1963. It is the duty of any captured Allied officer to try to escape their captors. It is important to drain the Nazis of as many resources as possible, and with any luck, to actually return across the battle lines. The Nazis have collected the biggest escape risks among their POWs and corralled them into a new state-of-the-art high-security prisoner camp. So the prisoners, led by RAF squadron leader Roger Bartlett, concoct an even bigger plan: dig 3 giant escape tunnels and break 250 men out of the camp. A project so big, it'll be difficult to hide, and it'll take a supreme amount of coordination and teamwork to dig, scrounge, build, sew, forge, and blackmail their way out of camp. At the same time, the camp threatens to be turned over from the Geneva Convention-abiding Luftwaffe to the dangerous SS. It's a race against the clock, and a challenge against the Nazis and the officers' own inner demons to make a great escape.
So this is obviously based on real events, and it's interesting the way they break this movie down because it is a 3-hour movie. And basically the first 2 hours are spent preparing to escape, and then the last hour is spent escaping. And that's a lot of time and screen time to get through.
Pretty much.
And a lot of the entertainment in this film comes from the the nitty-gritty process and trickery and essentially MacGyver style entertainment of rigging stuff together from nothing, kind of like the same entertainment you get from something like MacGyver or Gilligan's Island, in the sense of what can you do if you only have dirt and the slats from a bed? How can you put that together? Which is really interesting. Yeah.
Throughout this whole movie, I kept thinking that this is basically a bank heist movie without, going against the law. It's like they're actually trying to, it's like the good version of a bank heist, because everyone has a role, and they've, from the very beginning, you get the sense that all these prisoners know each other. They've been transferred around to different camps. They've been in the same camps before. So nobody ever shows up at the camp and they're like, who are you? They're like, oh, hey, you finally made it over to where we are. And then they're like, all right, so we have a forger, we have a digger, we have the lookout. Everyone has a job to do, kind of like that. You get the sense in organized crime movies where everyone we need a driver, we need a lookout, we need the safe expert, all that kind of stuff. And I thought that was really interesting that structure carried over into this escape movie, which I never thought of those two in the same kind of category before.
Yeah, and it's very upbeat and peppy for a lot of it. It does get into those dark moments where somebody dies trying to escape, or when you get to the very end and everything falls apart. But a lot of it is this very upbeat, kind of peppy style of entertainment, which doesn't necessarily match a lot of the World War II fare that we see. And a lot of that, I think, comes from the fact that this is a classic Hollywood movie. Essentially a blockbuster. It's a
little bit of a star vehicle.
It's got that Hollywood gloss on it from the classical era. Everybody comes into the camp. They've all either been captured or transferred from other camps, and they all start off looking way too clean. Just way cleaner than they ought to be. And
you kind of get the sense that the Nazis are a little soft too.
Yes, and that actually takes me to another point that I really enjoy about this movie, and that's that there are both the antagonistic side and the protagonistic side in this movie are fractured. There are factions within them. On the German side, the camp is being run by the Luftwaffe, who are ostensibly trying to be good about it. I don't know how much I really believe that, but sure. And then there are the SS agents who are trying to come in and be much, much harsher, and they take over by the end of the movie. And then on the protagonistic side, you have a bunch of, you have the Americans, you have the British, and then, of course, you have the wild cards like Steve McQueen, who it takes some wrangling from Richard Attenborough's character in order to get him into line. Which, one, makes all these people feel a lot more fleshed out and a lot less black and white. Although by the end, it definitely becomes that way. It resolves itself that way. But it provides a lot of interest and drama on screen to get us through those first 2 hours in a very entertaining fashion. Yeah.
And they do a good job of kind of splicing up those little segments of, kind of everyday life, and then the digging sections and the everything that they have to do to prepare to get out, and even adding in those darker elements. the scene of the character who gets shot down trying to scale the barbed wire fence comes
The
right
mole.
at the end. Yeah, so it comes right
And
at
not
the
in a
end.
mole is that he's an informant. He's a mole in that he digs really fast.
Yeah, in a mole-ish fashion. But that scene, that it's a really, obviously dramatically low scene comes right after one of the most joyful scenes in the whole film of the handful of American prisoners who have put on this big 4th of July celebration and are kind of inviting all the British soldiers over, and they're all kind of, poking fun at each other and stuff like that. I love the line where it says, how are you getting along without us? And the Americans are like, we're doing just fine. But they have this big party with this moonshine that they've made, and then right at the end of that, there comes this really, really low beat, which is a good way of just keeping interest going and not letting one emotion or kind of carry for too long. Especially, you don't want the high beats to carry for too long because you're in a prison movie and a World War II movie.
Yeah. It is. The stakes are high from the get-go based on just like our public knowledge, our common knowledge of the situation.
Yeah.
Right? Like it doesn't
They don't
feel...
have to do too much of proving that, there is a death threat every second.
Yeah, exactly. Like you can just assume it and kind of roll
Yeah.
with it. It doesn't have to be
Like
proven.
the mole is almost a red shirt, but not really, because he didn't have to die for us to realize that there is a legitimate danger here.
Yeah. He actually had a pretty interesting character arc where that I think wasn't
because-
like super duper fleshed out in the sense of like man isn't meant to be in captivity, and it does something to people to take away their freedom to that much of a degree. Like it's damaging.
He's the only character who has that kind of an arc where he's just completely demoralized by being in prison for so long. So that is the element that he brings to the film, which I think is really good. And then we have
Where's
Steve
the French
McQueen,
Canadian
who's-
guy just comes along to be French?
Yeah, I know. There's so many just like little, like there's an Aussie played by James Coburn, who I just always think of as a cowboy. And then he's an Aussie in this movie. It's like, oh, okay. And then Steve McQueen, who's just the cocky American, literally just standing in for all Americans. And then tons of great British actors in there as well.
Yeah, and this is an important movie in Steve McQueen's career, right? This is kind of early in it, and he does all of these amazing motorcycle stunts, and you can tell that those stunts, besides just being cool and seeing this big-ass landscape and seeing how close Switzerland is, but how far away it is through that barbed wire, you can tell it's all written for him. It was all put in for him, and to get that young
I think I saw that he... I think I saw that he requested that to be able to do the motorcycle stuff, just to show it off, which he did do all the motorcycle stuff himself, except for the very last jump, which was a stunt guy. But yeah, I think all of that was just him being like, come on, guys, you gotta get me on a motorcycle in this movie somehow.
Yeah.
And it worked out.
Right?
I mean, it's definitely the most exciting part. I think a lot of the posters are just Steve McQueen on a motorcycle, which made me think going into the movie that he was going to jump out of the prison on a motorcycle, which is not exactly the case.
No, that would have been
it's still a really
very
cool image.
difficult. That would have been cool, though.
Yeah.
I like that one of the things that I thought was really impressively done in this movie is, one, it's based on very, very, very factual events. I don't know exactly how accurate they are. I didn't do a lot of investigating into that. Obviously, Hollywood probably did some Hollywood stuff to it. But because of that, you're dealing with very specific states. You have to explain what the Geneva Conventions are, and you have to explain like what this camp is and who these people are and why they're trying to escape, while they're trying not to escape. Who are all these people? What Richard Attenborough has a scar, but we also get this exposition about him being super dangerous and a very, very high escape risk for the Nazi prison guards.
Well, that's one of the
but
things.
But we did it all through Nazis, which is something I've noticed in a lot of these movies we've been watching, is that Nazis just work great for exposition. The same thing happened in Patton, One, because it's interesting. We get to flip across the line real quick and see what the opposition is doing. But two, because they're typically discussing this with one of the POW officers. Most notably at the start of the film, they're having all these discussions with the British officer whose name escapes me, but he's notable because he walks with a cane and therefore is not eligible for escape.
Yeah.
Because it's coming through that contention, there's conflict in the scene, which distracts the audience from the fact that you're just feeding them all of this information by spoonfuls. And just getting it all out there really quickly at the beginning in a really interesting scene because there's heads butting, but not in a scene that feels like, here's the plot, sit through all this exposition.
Yeah, right. One of the things that I think is interesting about this movie is that in 1963, World War II, which still it's much less so now, but it was very much in living memory in 1963. In fact, so much to the point where several of the actors in this film had actually fought in World War II, so they had firsthand knowledge. Like, notably, the guy who goes blind, Donald Pleasance, I think, he had been a pilot in World War II, had been shot down, and spent a year in a German prison camp. So he understands the actual situation that they're portraying here. I think James Gardner had fought in the Korea War. So there's a lot of these people were so close to the actual events of the film that I think that probably helps in the way that they're able to portray, prison life and being soldiers and stuff like that. Because this is almost, it's not too far of a line between the acting and the just remembering kind of a thing, which I think is really interesting because the only time that we're going to see, at least specifically World War II movies that have that amount of realism injected into them are from that era or before. Like, the farther we get from World War II, the less of like firsthand knowledge we have to put into our depictions of it, which is really interesting.
Yeah. It definitely colors the portrayal of the events. I think the only way to get more real is to literally be Rossellini making movies in Italy as it's being recaptured from the Germans.
Which we're going to talk about next time. Stay tuned.
Yeah, in which they literally just like pulled random people of certain nationalities from the street to play certain parts.
Hashtag Italian neorealism.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, as far as the actual events that did happen, like we said, it was Hollywoodized, but a lot of it is pretty factual. So each of the characters is basically like a melding of several of the actual people who were captured in Stalag 3 or whichever prison camp that they were in. And so there's like some little differences, like they added a little bit more American involvement to suit the American audience, because I think most of the Americans had been transferred out of the prison right before the escape actually happened.
Yeah, it was almost all British officers.
Right. So like little things like that. But there was actually a time when a group of the surviving survivors of the Great Escape went back to the prison camp and watched this film. And while they were like, yeah, some of the stuff at the end, like, it's not exactly how it happened. They were like, at the beginning, like the prison life stuff and the escape digging and stuff like that is actually pretty accurate, which is interesting. Another thing that I think is interesting is just from some basic research, there were actually several anti-Nazi guards at the camp that helped them out and, actually did stuff for them. We kind of see it in the film as James Gardner is kind of coercing guards into helping, but some of them were not very averse to helping these guys get out and escape because they were actually against the Nazis, which is something that you don't see too much. But yeah, I mean, it's a thing. Not every not everyone in a uniform was completely committed to Hitler's ideals. So that's just another element to keep in mind when watching these kinds of movies and thinking about the interactions and dynamics of World War II.
Yeah. Of course, a lot of it was completely accurate, including the ending, which I guess, minor spoiler alert, was what they did. There was a war crime committed when 50 recaptured officers were all executed.
Yeah, which is so rough.
And that's one of the like hardest and I think most affecting scenes of the whole movie is when they're telling the guy with the cane that 50 were killed while escaping, or 50 were shot while escaping. And he asks when they were going to be back. And then the German officer just repeats, 50 were shot while escaping.
No, he asks how many were wounded.
Or how many were wounded.
And there were no wounded. But you can actually tell in that scene, which I think is also one of the really interesting nuances, is that the Nazi prison guard almost chokes on those words as he says them.
Yeah, the Luftwaffe officer
struggle.
Clearly did not sign up to be a war criminal.
Yeah,
but that's the side he's on.
So yeah, I mean it's epic and it's really interesting. It's not like straight action, but all of the stuff that it's leading up to, it builds really well, and then after the escape happens, all that, the whole ending scene is just so tense as we watch the escapees try to, once you've escaped, you have to still escape Germany, and that turns out to be even harder than escaping the prison. So
yeah. There's actually a really interesting sensation to that sequence, because we both the characters and we as an audience have been confined to that camp for 2 hours. Of the movie, and then suddenly you're just you're feeling that rush of excitement of finally seeing scenes outside of it. You're just as eager to be out of there as the characters are.
And it's notable that even though Steve McQueen is kind of our American eyes throughout the film, when he escapes the first time to get the map and chart out the nearby town, we don't go with him. We're still stuck in the prison with everyone else, just waiting for him to come back. So that really is the first time we leave the prison for the entire movie.
Yeah. And of course, this movie is, certainly a classic, if not for the fact that so many people know about it or heard about it, then for the fact that so much of it has been appropriated into other movies throughout the years. I mean, just think about Steve McQueen bouncing a baseball off of a wall in a cell. How many times have we seen something like that copied? Or this is a setup for, like you said, heist movies, which we've already talked about the invention of heist movies, but obviously this plays a big influence back into those prison break movies, prison break shows moving forward. Yeah. And obviously, as we mentioned at the very top of this section, Recess. It's already made its way down to kids' TV. So it is certainly influential and certainly a classic and worth the watch.
Absolutely. But now let's move on to a film with zero Hollywood gloss. Come and See from 1985.
Jason, take it away.
Come and See from 1985. In 1943, the Nazi Germans invade the Soviet territory of Belarusia, and soon a boy named Freya finds himself swept up in the action and absolute horror of World War II. Without much agency and in the constrained viewpoint of a youth having their innocence ripped away, Freya is hurled into the partisan Russian army. He meets fellow soldiers and a young woman named Galasha, and watches as his world falls apart in a series of fighting, war crimes, and other terrors. Come and See shows the experience of war you can hardly imagine without seeing it.
All right, Jonathan, I had not seen this movie before, but it is actually one of those movies that if you look through for lists of the top 250 films on Letterboxd, top 100 films on IMDb, it's on all of those lists. And after watching it, I understand why. But I think one of the most interesting things about it is the viewpoint through which both the events and the film, from our audience perspective, is experienced. It's incredibly limited and narrowed down to a child, who's thrown into a war. You kind of get a sense of it coming, but we actually see events that feel incredibly like the end of the world in a way that I don't think a lot of war films truly capture. Like that absolute just breaking and shredding down of humanity in this just
in a psychological
way. Just things like just atrocities left and right, war crimes left and right, the panicked you have no clear idea of what's going on for most of this movie. He's drafted into the army, he's thrown into it, but for a lot of it he's just wandering around from thing to thing, clinging to whatever sense of order or like anything would point him in the right direction throughout the course of the film. But he's just
through
flailing.
Denial and confusion and
everybody else is just everyone else is just falling apart too and suffering.
I think the thing that surprised me the most is because we put this on here because it keeps coming up on lists of best war films and stuff like that, and I heard about it for a long time, but I think I expected more of a brutality like Saving Private Ryan, or even like we'll see in The Thin Red Line, where it's a lot of battle back and forth and casualties and stuff like that. But that is not what makes Come and See brutal. What makes Come and See brutal is showing the absolute and utter inhumanity of the way that Nazis treated people that they did not see as human or of deserving human dignity. And that's exactly what they did as they marched their way through Russia and got however far they did. But as they went, they would burn towns and they would slaughter everyone in them.
Pillaging,
and so
raping.
we're seeing Nazi atrocities, which from the Russian point of view, which is different because we see a lot of those inhuman acts through the Holocaust, which we're going to, get into all of that a little bit later in the series. But this is a point of view that you don't see that often, but still it's the baseness of it and the coldness of it. It just makes you question throughout the whole thing, like what kind of a value system and worldview would permit this kind of thing. And, even as it goes through getting a little bit more towards the end, you hear the classic Nazi remarks. Well, they told us to do it. Well, he's the guy in charge. Well, we were just doing, whatever. And then finally one of the Nazis stands up and just like lays out the Nazi point of view. He's like, you don't deserve to live. I don't feel bad at all for what just happened. And as he's staring down, all of these people who he is just directly affected by, the crux of this film is around the razing of a village, RAZE. And
literally opposite of the other way you can say that word.
I know. It's so
If
I always
anybody
feel like I
wonders
have to
why
clarify
English
when I
is
say
such a
that.
hard language, that's why.
And then all the people who end up surviving that capture the Nazis and confront them, and you basically just imagine what happens after that. But it does present the whole philosophy of the Nazis, but it also presents the real life consequences and real life results of that philosophy in a really intimate and, again, I don't know what other word to use than just brutal.
It is literally the end of the world. This is the best apocalypse film I've ever seen. It's captured the breakdown of human society better than anything I could ever imagine.
It's not fiction.
And the shocking thing is it's real. And that's probably the scariest thing about it. And like it literally is, and they really go into that sense of this is the apocalypse. I mean, the name is from the Book of Revelations. Hitler is made into the apocalyptic horseman of death. Over the course of the film, they literally take a skeleton and carry him around, and then they cover him in like mud and hair in a way to make him look like Hitler. It's a really
you progressively
it's like people going.
There's so many visuals in this film that are so disturbing, and then there are sequences that just flow and they kind of distract you from what's going on, and then you're thrown right back into it again. The flow of this movie is brilliant in how disorienting it is, and then every time you start to get a little confused, you're just smacked in the face with something even worse than the last scene you just saw.
Yeah, it's real bad. It's real bad. Even certain things are hidden from the protagonist, but are just barely caught by us, such as like the pile of dead bodies, probably his family behind the cabin.
That the girl turns and sees for a split second as he's running away. I mean, he knows it, but he's in denial.
Yeah, he
and
doesn't
she even
wanna...
says that a little bit later on. Like, she says he's deaf, which he physically is from the bombing at that point, but it's also he's trying to shut it out and ignore it, which is kind of the only thing you can do at that point. So the other thing, if you are looking for a frame of reference, which is also a really obscure frame of reference, but the style is very Tarkovskian, which makes complete sense coming from Russia. But I think there was a scene where he was looking into a well, which reminded me of a scene from Yvonne's childhood, because Yvonne's childhood is probably, next to this film as in terms of putting war atrocities through the eyes of a child, which, puts all of war in a completely different perspective when you're looking at it through the eyes of youth and not the eyes of like hardened soldiers and stuff like that. Thinking of like Nick Nolte's character in the next movie we're going to talk about. But seeing it through the eyes of innocence, and then that's basically what this movie ends up being, is a loss of innocence throughout it. But that loss of innocence transcends this one kid and kind of turns into a cultural and national loss of innocence, almost, in a weird way. No, it does feel like that for sure. It is essentially a coming of age film, except way more brutal than any other coming of age film you could possibly imagine. Yeah.
And by the end, he takes a stand, and you see him fully commit to joining. It's not that he was ever really on the fence. It's just that he was kind of going along with the crowd at the top of the film, physically being drafted into the partisan army, which was resisting. But by the end, he was full bore.
He was kind of excited about it at the beginning.
Yeah, but he was excited about it in the way a little kid is. He's like, I'm going to go...
He was naively,
play
very
a war. Yeah. But by the end, he's like, this guy is the devil. He like literally shoots a portrait of Hitler he sees in a puddle.
That scene is so good.
He is now a hardened member of the partisan army and is ready to resist. Which is...
And then as the film ends, there's like this... The music is almost kind of... I don't know. I'm sure that it has much more significance if you're Russian, but it's kind of this big choral song that feels like a big kind of national rallying cry. As you see the partisans kind of walking off into the forest, just kind of prepared to keep resisting, because that's all there is at that point. But he definitely goes from kind of, I want to have a gun and be a soldier, to realizing how horrifying that is, to realizing he needs to be a soldier because to do anything else is to allow the end of the world. So, man, there's so much in this movie. But that scene where he shoots the portrait of Hitler is... We've seen lots of films so far that use footage from Triumph of the Will, because, like, as we talked about off air one time, Triumph of the Will gave the world the best professionally shot footage of the Nazis, and it's just there for the taking. And so the way that they use the footage, though, in this film is probably the most creative and impactful that I've seen, because as he's shooting this portrait of Hitler with a machine gun, you're seeing all the atrocities of war through the Holocaust and then through the battle, and then through like the even the National Socialist rally from Triumph of the Will, and it just goes backwards and backwards and backwards, almost like he's trying to undo everything by this act of rage, and then it ends with what I can only assume. I haven't actually looked this up, but I assume it's actually a portrait of Hitler as a baby.
Would you go back in time and kill Hitler as a baby if you could?
That's literally the question that this film raises. By the time you're done with this movie, there's no other answer than heck yeah.
It makes a big stand that this is some real bad stuff. It is, and it kind of gives that experience of people. It kind of gives a semi-civilian experience of the war too, right? Like these guys wouldn't be this partisan army wouldn't be a bunch of fighters. They're not a bunch of fighters. You see them at the top of the movie. They are not a hardened army, and not even close. They get there kind of by the end of the movie, and it gives this interesting experience of not just a boy, but a whole people who have their innocence stripped away and are forced to become hardened people who corner and burn Nazis. Which, despite the evilness of the Nazi regime, that is a dehumanizing thing to do. Even if the people you are burning alive are evil and dehumanized in their own right, having to kill is something that fractures yourself. So these are broken people by the end. They are transformed in this terrifying way over the course of the movie.
I think there's a really interesting image.
Cinematography is really good.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
They use a lot of really great distortion shots, those close-up wides that I actually was literally kind of bitching about in King's Speech. But in this movie, they make perfect sense.
Yeah, and they do like this really interesting kind of use of the vertigo push zoom when they're taking a photo of the whole regiment that's about to get kind of obliterated. But there's also this really interesting image at the very beginning of the film, because the film opens with our main character, Floria, who wants to join the army, and I guess not his little brother, but like a younger friend who's not really old enough to join the army, and they're digging around in this sand where there's a bunch of dead bodies trying to get a gun so that they can join. And there's a moment, it's like a really kind of surreal way to open the film in the way that it's shot and presented. And then there's a shot of the little boy in like full uniform with a bone in his mouth, and he makes like a really weird barking sound. And that image kind of just starts the whole movie with this idea of, again, the dehumanizing effects of war. Just being in the soldier's uniform is kind of a debasing place to be. And I think that there's a lot of really interesting, subtle images like that throughout the film. I just saw, just doing a quick scan on Wikipedia, one reviewer used the phrase that the film was made with an angry elegance, which I think is a really apt description of the movie.
Yeah, no, it really, really is. This is one of those movies where I was pulling stills and it was hard to really narrow it down. It was...
Yeah.
Everything was just beautiful. Everything seemed perfectly timed, which is a crazy thing to say because everything is also horrifying.
Yeah.
But it worked.
Yeah, it's really hard to describe without, because what the film does is it gives you a feeling, and we've talked about films like that before, but it really just kind of makes a mental impression on you by the end in a way that is hard to describe without just sitting down and watching it and going through the whole thing. So, oh boy. So let's move on to our final film of the day. Going back to some American filmmaking in a very different vein than The Great Escape, The Thin Red Line from 1998. Set it up for us, Jason.
The Thin Red Line from 1998. U.S. Army Private Witt is picked up and arrested from an island of a carefree Melanesian village. From there, he is shipped off with the rest of his squadron to Guadalcanal to secure Hill 210, providing the space for a key airfield in the Pacific War. All of that fades away as the company slogs its way up the hill, losing member after member to desperate Japanese resistance. Whit and the other soldiers face their nature as living beings, ones who do not want to die, and who are suddenly faced with the imminent event. Whit himself thinks about the woman he left behind. A line is towed between thought and action as the soldiers fight to move the thin red line.
Okay, as much as I really like the use of voiceovers in this movie, am I the only one that thinks Jim Caviezel's southern accent is really kind of schmaltzy?
It's pretty small, yes. Yep. I have a tolerance level of voiceovers in Terrence Malick films, and it ends when the accent gets too extreme or when they start whispering.
Yeah. There was
that's it.
There was some really good use of voiceover in this movie, but occasionally, yeah, like the very first one, when Jim Caviezel starts, I was like, oh, okay, that southern accent is like really laid on thick, which is kind of the point. Although, like, I guess half of the soldiers in this regiment are southern, but yeah, this is a battle film that is philosophical and beautiful and brutal all at the same time, in a way that a lot of American battle movies usually aren't. They usually kind of try to focus on the brutality element and the action element, without asking too many questions. And this film is all about asking questions.
Yeah, it very much is. It almost feels more like a 3-hour poem.
Kind of.
Than it does. And that's actually a lot of modern Malick films. I felt that way about Hidden Life too. Like, especially with
definitely.
his use of essentially prose poetry in the voiceover slot, which is something very unique
a lot different.
To him. Yeah.
In A Hidden Life, it was a very kind of slow subject about this peasant being taken away and just, you know, having to stand up for himself over and over and over again. But when you put that same kind of poetry into a battle where people are being shot and blown up and still trying to get that grittiness and just rawness of battle, and then adding to that poetry and beauty, it's a really weird mix, but Malick makes it work really well.
It does. A lot of the reviews that I read, I ended up on this kick where I was reading reviews of this movie from the time it came out. Yeah, from 98. And a lot of people were like, I really liked it. It felt a little schizophrenic. It felt like it didn't know what it in itself was about, but I really liked it. And I think that comes from the fact that it is supposed to essentially be more of a question. Like, it's supposed to provoke thought more than it is meant to present answers of a sort.
Almost every voiceover is a character asking questions of themselves as they go through, which sometimes felt a little disjointed to the characters themselves. Like Nick Nolte's voiceovers at the very beginning are very kind of introspective, and he's thinking about, like, you know, what does a guy have to do to get ahead? How many people does he have to step on? And that kind of thing, which makes you feel like he's a very kind of introspective and recent character. And then he ends up kind of being the antagonist. I mean, as much as you can within the same ranks in a war movie. But so that was interesting because it's showing multi-facets of his character, but also those introspective voiceovers from Nick Nolte kind of drop off towards the middle parts of the film. And they're, you know, I think Jim Caviezel's character is probably the main character, although that's kind of hard to say in this
that's such an accurate statement.
Ensemble.
He's probably the main character. I don't know for sure.
Kind of.
But maybe.
Yeah. Also, there was, like, given the amount of gigantic names in this film, I was surprised at how much trouble I was having with face blindness with all these white American soldiers.
That happens every time, not only when there's a lot of white people, but when they're all in the military too, because they're literally in uniforms. All their hair has been cut. They're wearing helmets. It's
There are a couple of them that are easier to pick out than others, but sometimes I was just like, wait, which one are you again?
yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah, so I mean, from the very beginning, the film starts in this kind of idyllic, dreamlike kind of a state, which is kind of a metaphor for the quote unquote better place or other world that Jim Caviezel's trying to get to and get away from the war. And then we get into the battle, and it takes a while to kind of figure out what exactly the battle is going to be until we get down to the nitty gritty of basically what it comes down to is Nick Nolte's general wants to take this hill at whatever cost, but he's not there, and the captain who is there doesn't want to sacrifice all his men because he sees another way that might be a little bit slower, but he thinks it's better, and he's going to take that way even against direct orders. So that kind of becomes a battle, and then Nick Nolte realizes that he was right in the first place. The other captain, and I'm not sure if I'm using all of these ranks right, but you'll kind of get the point if you've seen the movie. And so there's this power struggle, there's this authority struggle, and then once we finally get up to the hill, there's the aftermath kind of a thing. So we've been seeing American soldiers get killed all the way trying to storm the hill, and then by the time we get up there, then the Americans are, dealing with the Japanese directly. And we talked about a little bit in the propaganda episode, or maybe just in the bonus, but about this idea that it's easy to make Hitler the bad guy of the German parts of the war, but it was harder to have like a single thing to pin the battle against the Japanese on. And so a lot of times the Japanese would become stereotyped, or the Japanese people would be the enemy and that kind of thing. And this movie does it. It's interesting because the film focuses mostly on the American army, and for like the first almost half of the film, you don't see like the faces of any Japanese soldiers at all. And then when we get up there, we're seeing the Americans be brutal to the Japanese. And I think one of the most striking parts of the movie to me was when we see a fallen Japanese soldier, and we get a voiceover from the fallen Japanese soldier, basically bringing up those questions of, do you think you were better than me? You think I didn't try to live a good life? Asking all these kind of, traditional war questions of who has the right to live, the victor or the victim? Like, who gets to decide that? And when you're on that really nitty gritty soldier level, there's really no good answers.
Yeah. Yeah, no, there's really not. It doesn't feel like what they're doing is really connected to a larger conflict, especially because it's narrowed down to such a small portion.
We're really
of
disconnected from the big picture.
Yeah, it's it was interesting because I've seen this movie before, but I never stopped to consider what battle this was a part of, and then I paid attention and I realized this is Guadalcanal, which is commonly seen as like the turning point, or one of the big turning points in the Pacific War, when the Americans started winning. And actually the airstrip they're securing is incredibly important to the war effort, but it doesn't feel like that, because they don't, when you're on that hill just pushing to fight for that little line on a map some commander's worried about, you're not worried about that. You're thinking about your life. You're thinking about your loved ones. You're thinking about the fact you might die charging up that hill. And for what reason? What purpose? Why? As the narration says, I think approximately 200 times, why?
Yeah, right. Yeah, and you're right, that thin red line, which is kind of what the whole movie is about, is, it looks all clean cut on a map, but once you're actually, trying to do that, what does that mean? What does that mean on an individual, personal level? What does that mean for the people associated with those soldiers? all of that kind of stuff. As we see the one, I don't even remember which one, the one soldier's marriage kind of falls apart just because he's gone. Not even because of anything that he did.
That's a vicious, like, Dear John letter he gets. It's really polite, but that's like what makes it so bad.
Yes, it's so like not what the whole film is about, but it's such like a little personal loss that feels so intense and feels almost more intense than
it devastates. It devastates us. Well, yeah, that's the point. That's the point. Is that it? That the conflict doesn't really matter to these guys on a personal level. They care whether or not they survive, and we're seeing why they care whether or not they survive. And we've been seeing all these flashbacks of this woman he's in love with, and we are forming our own assumptions about her based on everything that we've seen, how he feels about her. We're getting her entirely through his memories.
Yeah.
And then that letter kind of snaps us out, reminds us that she's not that person. She might have been at one point.
There is the setup.
Which setup?
There is a setup for it. At the very beginning, someone asks him, why are you just a private when you used to be a captain or whatever? Again, I don't know how the ranks work, but he says because of my wife.
Okay.
He says because my wife didn't want me to be gone for that long. We'd never been separated, and when I had all these responsibilities, I had to be gone all the time, and she didn't like that. And so now I'm just like an ordinary soldier, and I have more time. So there's kind of this setup that she has problems being separated from him. It's very subtle, and then at the end we realize, she really has problems being separated with him for some reason.
Yeah. And it is literally in the moment what's happening is his life ends when he reads that letter. He doesn't die in battle. He dies when he reads that letter. When he perceives that his wife has made him into a write-off, essentially.
Yeah. It's almost one of those things I felt like going back to an unrelated movie, Lethal Weapon, where at that point, he has nothing to stop him from doing something crazy and, semi-suicidal, where, he can, it makes it easier for him to do something that would put his life on the line at that point, because after this, his life is completely different anyway. So it's just all these things that are building up, inside of the battle, outside of the battle. It does a really good job of fitting so many different perspectives into one movie, and still feeling cohesive.
It does. And part of that's the reason that it's 3 hours long.
Right, yeah, this one is also 3 hours long.
Yep, lots of long movies over this subject, but that kind of makes sense. It's deep, and there's a lot to tackle. And the more time that goes by from it happening, the more solemn we treat it, the more it becomes kind of not just history. It becomes legend, myth. It becomes important and vital to how the perceptions of it that we have become more and more important, more and more sacred in a way on a social level.
And it becomes more important to not let it fade. The urgency of the memory of this event becomes more felt as time goes on, because if it does fade, then there's nothing stopping it from happening again. But the more we can see how terrible this thing was from every possible point of view, the more likely it is to be prevented in the future.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. You know what, Jonathan? One of the things that I found really interesting in this movie, especially in the way it treated, the concept of fighting for these men, is how excellently shot and choreographed the fight scenes are. It is. You could easily have the camera and the audience be lost in all of this long grass,
which they do intentionally sometimes.
Sometimes they do that intentionally, but it's used. It's very consciously used.
Yeah. Yeah, they do a really good
by
job.
The director. You have a very clear idea of what's going on, where you are, through combination of both
geography
cinematography,
is really good.
narration, all of that. it's put together, and it makes for some really good action sequences. Even if you aren't here for the narration and the philosophical wondering, the action sequences are really phenomenal, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, and there's so many little moments throughout the action that feel so real because they're so big and inconsequential at the same time. So I'm thinking of like the instance where there's a soldier who's been shot and he's screaming for help, but the spot where he is like heavily covered by fire, and one of the medics is like, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna go help him, and he runs out there, and as soon as he gets there, he gets shot down immediately. And then another soldier goes out to help him and actually gets there and hands him the morphine, but he can't pick him up and bring him back. So he literally just has to leave him there with the morphine and go back to safety because, you know, having 3 people die over him, you know, trying to fix his wounded leg is not worth it. And so there's so many just little instances like that, you know, they're just war. That's just how it is.
Yeah. It's a series of impossible decisions that the characters are faced with. And in it being a series of impossible decisions, it's a ripe planting ground for philosophical questions, which I think is what attracted Malick to it in the first place. Because that really does seem like the kind of guy he's in. He
yeah,
is.
absolutely. Yeah. Okay, here's a quick question, Alex. Why is the Thin Red Line kind of obviously it is still hailed as one of the great war movies and stuff like that, but why do you think it is one of those ones that people can't kind of wholly get behind, kind of like Saving Private Ryan and stuff like that? Like it's so close to being an award-winning film, it's so close to being a classic film, and yet it's kind of just fallen by the wayside of other big war movies from America and from other countries when thinking back on World War II films.
You know, I think part of the reason is that Malick makes his movies for him. Very much so.
Yeah.
He doesn't really make them for anybody else. You know, they're long. They're a little slower. They're a little more philosophical. If you haven't had a cup of coffee beforehand, you might fall asleep during it. Even like during something like this that's so impeccably choreographed and set up, there's a lot of just slow thinking time added to the movie so that you can have those same thoughts the soldiers are having, have those same thoughts that Malick is having, or trying to answer the same questions he's trying to answer. That it just doesn't grab and pull you back in the same way that other 3-hour movies do. Like Schindler's List is another 3-hour movie that is I think, probably much more popular than the Thin Red Line. Definitely. But, you know, in something like Schindler's List, there is a stand taken. There is a certain... There's something that you arrive at. It's not a series of questions. It is a story. There's a takeaway with a takeaway. Clear. That's very very definite, and you can get behind that, and you want to see the journey the characters take. Whereas in this movie, maybe the characters don't really take that much of a journey. Maybe they just die while having a bunch of philosophical questions pinged at them, and that's not
which makes it realer, but less.
Which does make it realer. Which does exciting. Make it more of a thinking movie, but it does make it less of an entertaining movie. And I think no matter where you go or what your thoughts are on movies, you have to every single movie has components that are commercial, components that are entertainment driven, and components that are artistically driven. And if you swing away from any one of those too far, you end up with something that is slightly lesser than. Not unappealing, but I think the art of movie making is partially the art of trying to balance those different pulls and interests on what a movie can be. And I think Malick has definitely just gone full-blown artistic, all the way, which is great. We need movies
Yeah.
like that, but it's never going to be the most popular movie out there.
That's true, especially when there are other films covering the same subject from a more commercial point of view.
Yes.
Along those lines, follow-up question. What do you think about the use of so many dadgum movie stars? You know, you have Sean Penn, Adrian Brody, Jim Caviezel, George Clooney, John Cusack, Woody Harrelson, Nick Nolte, John C. Reilly, and John Travolta, for goodness sake. Like,
Yeah, really young John C. Reilly, too. Like, it's...
Yeah.
Before he really becomes famous for his work with Will Ferrell. Yeah, it's interesting. It almost seems unexpected looking backwards, but you got to remember some of these guys did their best work afterwards. Adrian Brody, John C. Reilly, Jared Leto's in this. He's like the first guy who dies, I think.
Yeah.
But a lot of their best work
it's crazy how many of them
afterward.
are big names now.
Yeah. I think a lot of people
Almost in the same way that like Black Hawk Down has a lot of like startups who went on to do really big things.
Yeah. I think part of it is that this is a very clearly a heavily artsy movie, and I think that attracts certain types of actors to it. And it also
who don't always get that opportunity.
It's also very clearly, like, you read the script, you very clearly think this has awards potential. And looking at all those nominations, it definitely does. Or definitely did. Unfortunately, it didn't win any, but it definitely did.
If nothing else, it's a prestigious resume addition, you know?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I know it definitely is appealing to actors for a lot of reasons. Plus, you get to go act on location. This is a location shoot. You get to work with a director who's done some really famous movies who are already in the Criterion Collection. One of the most, auteur skewing film brats of that generation. It is definitely an opportunity for actors, and I think we see that in the number of people who agree to be in this movie.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and again, it helps with the face blindness, but it doesn't totally get rid of it. No matter what you do, when you put them all in uniform, they just blend together, which is part of the point. And I think that's having recognizable actors helps you remember that each of these are individuals and they're not just statistics, I guess. So yeah, let's talk about all three of these. This is our war battle film episode. So we've gone, behind the lines in the POW camp. We've had the German invasion coming at us in Russia, and then we've been on the charge in the Pacific in the Thin Red Line. So I think we've covered the gamut of war films. Obviously, we left off some really popular war films like Saving Private Ryan and stuff like that, but this gives a really good idea of the way that war films are approached when it comes to World War II. And they're not done being made. We're still making World War II films. So what have we learned thus far, Alex?
Well, action can be all sorts of different. Action is inherently exciting and definitely, I think, inherently treated as a heavily blockbuster genre. But in its meeting with World War II, I think you see that action can also be a heavily thoughtful genre, a genre in which you see physical conflict of humans resulting in philosophical questions and larger moral themes at play. And you can treat that in different ways, right? Like in The Great Escape, it's way more entertaining than in the other two in terms of the way the action is treating. It's exciting. It's almost like a fun adventure until it's not, and you realize that there's big stakes at play. And Come and See, the action is terrifying and horrifying and shows you the worst of mankind. In The Thin Red Line, it poses the physical conflict is well choreographed and interesting to look at, but at the same time terrifying, but in this existential way that makes you question your own purpose in life. And And in those three movies, we also see like the different scopes you can take in a movie. Is it a movie with where you see wide-reaching ramifications, like The Great Escape? Is it something very narrow, like The Thin Red Line or Come and See, where we see individuals or individual groups and how they're affected by the action of war?
Yeah, and how fictionalized is it too? Because The Great Escape is a pretty well documented event. So is The Thin Red Line. Come and See is more of a representation of a larger thing that happened. So it's not really like, you know, this is exactly how this one town was destroyed. It's like this happened literally at the end of the film. It ends with 600 and however many towns were completely destroyed and all of their inhabitants killed as the Germans marched through Russia. So this is, you know, the factuality of Come and See is completely irrelevant because it is portraying an experience had by a lot of people in Russia, whereas The Thin Red Line is a specific event, but also showing the general experience of the soldiers and the general threats and conflicts and, you know, personality clashes on one level and questions of the morality of war. Like the one soldier who kills somebody and he says, "I just killed a man. This is the worst thing you can do, and nobody can touch me for it," and stuff like that. So the factuality of a particular battle can be, you know, stretched to varying degrees, and depending on the point of the film, you know, has varying degrees of actual relevance. Like the more true you can be to The Great Escape, you know, is going to be a little bit more interesting. And especially when the film came out and there's still people who were literally part of that event who are going to be watching the film. And obviously it wasn't completely true, but that's one where the truth matters a little more than Come and See and stuff like that.
Yeah. It's the difference between a realistic take on events and a take that's more almost impressionistic, where you're seeking to get the point across, but direct accuracy isn't nearly as important.
Yeah. And there's also a question that comes up throughout these of, especially in the more like, in the fight movies, like Come and See and The Thin Red Line, of how do you present this experience that, especially at this point, being so far removed from World War II and other like really large global conflicts like that, how do you present this experience and make it felt when most people watching it will not have had any experience similar to it? And I think that they both do a really good job of showing both the visceral side of the emotional element, like in Come and See, and also the feeling of almost irrelevance, that, like, you know, as one soldier, what makes your fight important and that kind of thing in The Thin Red Line. So there's a lot of different perspectives.
Certainly. And there's a number of films we didn't even get to today. But, you know, obviously these can run the gamut. I mean, we almost put Saving Private Ryan in here, which is a very different take on action and the purpose of it, and gets into, you know, a bit of that why we fight mentality that we saw in some of the earlier propaganda films. That's kind of a little lacking in something like The Thin Red Line, but is very much there in Come and See and The Great Escape. Like, there's very much a reason to why those people are fighting. There's 1,000 different ways you can bend it. And, you know, with a conflict like World War II that's so large and so pervasive in history and so recent that, you know, it's ripe planting ground for discussions like this.
Yeah, and let's throw out a couple, you know, like further watching picks as far as World War II battle films.
Ivan's Childhood?
Yeah, so we've got Yvonne's Childhood, which we've already covered, but then, like, we didn't even we didn't even talk about D-Day today. And there's like The Longest Day, which is an American take. There's Overlord, which is kind of a British take, which mixes actual footage from D-Day with a fictionalized account of a soldier. You know, on the Polish side, there's Kanal. There's Downfall, which I haven't seen yet, but I think that's the one that the Hitler meme comes from, is about the Nazis in their bunker as the war comes to an end. There's some more recent ones like Hacksaw Ridge and stuff like that. Even The Dirty Dozen, which is almost the same cast as The Great Escape and very similar in tone because it's right around the same time. So there's just so many movies that kind of fall into this category that we've tried to cover generally with these three movies. Any honorable mentions that you can think of?
No, I mean you really just threw a list there. But yeah, there's
Came prepared.
Yeah, but there are plenty out there, and plenty more to be talked about in the future. And certainly, I think some of our next two episodes include action-y movies, but who focus more on different aspects of World War II.
Yeah,
but
a little bit.
You could easily dedicate months and months to just watching World War II action films. In fact, I think many people do just that.
I'm sure. Yeah, so let's talk about what we are going to talk about next time on the show, which is going to be our second to last episode in the series, and we're going to talk about the drama. So we're going to go a little bit even more granular and get to still a couple soldier perspectives, but also getting more into this civilian side. So what are those movies, Alex?
Well, next week on the podcast, Jonathan, we're going to be starting off by talking about Paisan from 1946, which is one of Roberto Rossellini's war trilogy films made right at the end of World War II, which also include Roma Città Aperta, Rome Open City, which we already did on the podcast back during the World Tour series, and Germany Year Zero. But Paisan is the one we're focusing on. And then we're going to talk about Army of Shadows from 1969, which is a French movie directed by Jean-Pierre Melville, which depicts the actions of a cell of French resistance fighters during World War II. And then last but not least, we're going to talk about Schindler's List from 1993, Spielberg's epic opus to the Holocaust victims and the rescuers, of whom Oskar Schindler is one but many, but probably the most famous rescuer of the heroic group of people who decided that what the Nazis were doing was wrong and sought to rescue as many Jewish people, men, women, and children, from the Holocaust as possible. So it's going to be a heavier week on the show.
Yep.
But
still
that's
not going to be the heaviest week of the show. That's to come.
The last one's going to be real bad.
Yeah.
It's dark. But that's next week's lineup. So we're going to talk about that next week. Jonathan, for those who want to support the show, what should they do?
Yeah, so you can check us out on Patreon. We have two tiers. If you want to support us for $2 a month, you can get access to our community and some behind-the-scenes content. And if you want to support us for $5 a month, we have a bonus podcast, which, as we've mentioned, our topic several times on this show, but the last episode that we just released of the bonus podcast is Terrence Malick's A Hidden Life, which just was released. It's probably just leaving theaters, but that is his film about an Austrian conscientious objector who refused to join the army after Austria was annexed by Nazi Germany. So very different from The Thin Red Line, but same Terrence Malick style and kind of questioning approach. And also, quick note that we are now releasing all episodes on YouTube. Last week's episode was actually a video episode, so if you would like to see our faces for some reason, you can go and check that out on YouTube. But we are going to be posting the podcast on YouTube, even if it's just an audio episode, for those of you who consume a lot of YouTube content, which I know there are many people out there who like to just put YouTube on in the background. So we have provided that as a way to experience our show. If you should so wish,
if you put us on in the background.
We would be so honored.
All right, guys. Well, I think that's all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Geringer.
And I am at the Blue Jay 1994.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya. I watched that video essay about Recess. That guy really likes Recess.
Recess was a really good show.
I only watched a little bit of it. It wasn't one that I had a very good knowledge of, but he knows every single episode.
Yeah. It was a little bit before when I really started watching TV in terms of being old enough to remember what I watched.
Right.
But it was a really good show. And yes, the theme music for the Disney show Recess is based on The Great Escape.